What would you do if the world stripped you bare, put you on a road with nothing but the clothes on your back, and left you to bargain for shelter with the last 3 coins in your pocket? What would you do if the only roof you could afford was one no one else would touch, a dead lord's hunting lodge sold for the price of a loaf of bread, its doors nailed shut against a story no one in the village would speak aloud? This is the tale of Susan Marsh, 19 years old, cast out with nothing, who spent her last $3 on Felwick Lodge and found inside it a reckoning no one expected. Stay close, settle in, let us know where you're watching from. What she uncovered in those damp and shuttered rooms would rewrite everything the village thought it knew. The carrier's cart set her down at the crossroads outside Felwick Village a little before dusk, and Susan Marsh stood in the wet road with her small bundle held against her chest and watched the wheels roll on without her. Rain had passed through earlier and the hedgerows still dripped. Her boots were mended at the toe with a bit of waxed thread she had done herself, and the hem of her gray wool dress was heavy with the mud of 3 counties. She had walked much of the way. What coach fare she had spent was gone now, and what remained in the small pouch at her waist amounted to $3 in worn silver, the whole of her fortune in the world. She had been turned out of her uncle's house in the last week of October. There had been no shouting, only a short letter read aloud in the parlor and a bag set down at the front step. Her father's debts, her uncle said, had eaten what little he had meant to leave her. Her mother had been dead 9 years. There was no one else. She had taken the road east because someone at the coaching inn had spoken of a provincial sale room where cottages went for shillings and unclaimed lots for less, and she had thought, in the plain flat way she thought most things now, that a roof was a roof. The village lay a half-mile down the lane. Smoke curled from a few slate chimneys. A dog barked once behind a wall and fell silent. Susan lifted her bundle higher and began to walk. The sale room stood behind the coaching inn, a low brick building with a single yellow lamp burning at the door. Inside, a dozen men in frock coats and mud-splashed gaiters stood about a table where an auctioneer in a rusty black hat was reading off lots in a bored, hurried voice. Small parcels of land, a pony trap in poor repair, a quantity of stable ironwork. Susan slipped in at the back and stood against the wall. The lot came late. The auctioneer coughed, shuffled his papers, and spoke without lifting his eyes. Felwick Lodge and its immediate ground. Hunting lodge on the north edge of the old estate, long deserted. Roof said to be sound in parts. Sold as it stands, with all fixtures and contents. Opening bid $1. No hand moved. A man near the front laughed shortly. "Give it to the crows," he said. Another muttered, "Give it to the devil. He owns it already." A ripple of low laughter went round the table. The auctioneer's mouth thinned. $1, he repeated. 2. Any advance. Susan stepped forward. Her voice, when it came, was quieter than she meant. $3. Heads turned. Someone whistled. The man in the front, a broad-shouldered squire with a red face and a silver watch chain, looped across his waistcoat, twisted round on his stool, and looked her up and down as one might look at a stray. $3, he said, loud enough for the room. For Felwick, girl, you'd get better shelter under a hedge. The laughter came again, easier this time. Susan did not answer. She kept her eyes on the auctioneer. He held her gaze a moment, then brought his small wooden hammer down on the table with a flat, tired knock. "Sold," he said. To the young woman at the back, $3. God help her. The clerk wrote her name in a ledger with a nib that scratched. She counted out the 3 silver coins onto the wood one by one and heard each one settle. When she had signed, the clerk pushed across a folded paper and, from a hook on the wall behind him, took down a great iron key, black with age and long as her hand. He set it on the counter without a word. The squire had come up behind her. He smelled of pipe tobacco and wet wool. "You've bought a grave, girl," he said close to her ear. "Nothing lives up there, nothing has for years. When you've had your fill of the damp, come down and I'll buy the key off you for a shilling. Save you the walk back." Susan folded the paper into her bodice. She took the key in both hands. It was heavier than it looked. She turned and walked past him without answering, and the low laughter followed her out into the lane. Was it foolishness that made a girl of 19 spend her last $3 on a house the whole village called a grave? Or did she see, in that first cold moment at the sale-room table, something none of them had bothered to look for in 20 years? And what truly had the dead lord left behind those nailed doors that no heir, no clerk, no creditor had ever come to claim? If you're already leaning in, do us a kindness, leave a comment and subscribe so the rest of this story finds you. Because the road up to Felwick Lodge was longer than Susan knew, and what waited at the end of it had been waiting a very long time. Outside the sale room the lane had gone blue with dusk. The rain had left, but the cold had not. And Susan stood for a moment under the yellow lamp, with the iron key held against her ribs. Through the open door she could still hear them. The squire's voice was loudest. He was telling the room what he had told her, and the room was laughing the way rooms laugh when a joke has been rehearsed for years. $3, she heard him say. $3 for a grave. She'll be back before Sunday, said another voice. She'll be back before breakfast, said a third, and the laughter rose again. Susan walked on. The lane bent past the coaching inn, past a butcher's shuttered window, past a low cottage where a woman was drawing in washing from a line. The woman paused with a shirt half folded and watched Susan pass. She did not speak. A boy on a doorstep pointed at the great key and whispered something to a smaller child who stared. At the pump in the square, two men in flat caps stopped talking as she came near, and did not begin again until she had gone past. She kept her eyes forward. She had learned, in the last month, that a face held still gave less for people to take. At the far end of the square, where the road climbed and the last of the houses gave onto open field, an old woman was sitting on a stone bench under a yew. She wore a black shawl pinned at the throat with a bit of bone, and her hands were folded on the top of a stick. Her eyes were pale as skimmed milk, but they moved to Susan without effort, as if they had been waiting for her. Susan slowed. She did not know why. Something in the way the old woman sat, quite still, quite upright, made her feel she had been expected all afternoon. "You've the key," the old woman said. Her voice was thin and formal and carried further than it should have. "Yes," Susan said. The old woman looked at the key, then at Susan's face, then past her toward the north, where the road climbed into the trees. She was quiet a long moment. When she spoke, it was slowly, and each word set down like a stone laid on a wall. "He did not leave it empty, child. He left it full and turned the lock." Susan waited for more, but no more came. The old woman's eyes drifted from her, back to the road, and her hands settled again on the top of the stick. Whatever door had opened had closed. Susan opened her mouth, closed it, and after a moment said only, "Thank you." The old woman did not answer. Behind Susan, at the top of the square, a heavier tread came up. She knew it before she turned. The squire had followed her out. He stood with his coat open and his thumbs in his waistcoat, the silver chain catching what light was left. "Girl," he said, "a word." Susan turned. "I'll say it once more, plainly." He was smiling the smile she had learned to distrust in men who thought themselves reasonable. "That house has been sold to fools 3 times in my life, and each of them came back down this hill within a week begging for a bed at the inn. You've not the coin for the inn, you've not the sense for the hill. Give me the key. I'll give you a shilling and the name of a woman in Marley who takes girls in for scrubbing work. It's more than you'll find at the top of that road." Susan looked at him. She did not answer. His smile thinned. "You've a stubborn face on you," he said. "You'll wear that off by morning." He turned back toward the yellow lamp and the laughter, and did not look at her again. Susan shifted the key to her other hand and began to walk up the hill. The road out of Felwick village climbed for the better part of an hour. It was a rutted lane, banked on either side by hedgerows gone wild, the May hawthorn already stripped by autumn and the blackthorn showing its dark sloes. Water stood in the wheel ruts. The wind came down off the higher ground, carrying the smell of wet bracken, and, once, faintly, the smell of wood smoke from somewhere she could not see. The last light of the day lay along the tops of the hedges in a thin band of copper. Below the band, the world was already gray. Susan walked with her bundle against her chest and the iron key in her right hand. Her boots took on more water. She stopped once, at a stile, to breathe, and once again to shift the key because it had begun to numb her fingers. She did not stop a third time. She had learned in the last month that stopping too often was how a person sat down at the side of a road and did not get up. The lane forked. A weathered post leaned to the left, and on it, cut into the wood so old the letters had gone green, she could just make out the word Fellwick, and, beneath it, an arrow. She took the left fork. The trees closed in, beech mostly, and old and unpruned. Their leaves lay a foot deep on the track and made no sound under her boots because they were sodden through. The last of the copper light went out of the sky. She came around a bend, and the lodge was there. It stood in a clearing where the beeches drew back to make room for it, and for a moment Susan thought she had come to the wrong place, because the building was larger than she had expected, and lower and blacker. It was a long two-story house of dark local stone, with a slate roof that sagged at one end and stood square at the other, and a great blind door studded with iron in the center of its front. All the windows on the ground floor had been boarded from the outside with rough planks. The upper windows had their shutters closed and pegged. Ivy had climbed the west gable and reached the chimney. A yew, older than the house, leaned across the front step as though it had been set there to guard the door. There was no light. There was no sound but water dripping off leaves. Susan stood in the clearing a long moment. Then she crossed to the door, set her bundle down on the step, and put the key into the lock. It would not turn. She set her weight against it. She used both hands. The lock was stiff with rust and disuse, and for a bad minute she thought the squire had been right, that the key was only iron for a shilling, and the door was shut against her for good. Then something inside the mechanism gave with a low, grinding cough, and the bolt slid back. The door did not swing. She had to push it, shoulder to the wood, and it opened onto a cold breath of air that smelled of stone, damp linen, and old ash. Susan did not go in yet. She stood on the threshold and looked into the black hall, and listened. The house was quiet in the particular way of houses that have been quiet a very long time. She thought of the old woman on the stone bench and the words she had said, and she thought of the squire. And she thought of the 3 silver coins she had set down one by one on the auctioneer's wood. She stepped inside. She did not try the upper floor that night. She could not have found her way. She felt along the wall of the hall until she came to a doorway on her right, and passed through into what had been, by the shape of the hearth, a kitchen. There was a stone floor, a scrubbed table pushed against one wall, a settle beside the fireplace. In the grate lay the black ghost of a fire someone had left half-burned a long time ago. Susan put her bundle down on the settle. She unfolded her shawl and laid it flat. She sat on the settle with her back against the wall and the iron key in her lap. She meant only to rest her legs. She meant to gather herself and then go and find a candle, if a candle was to be found, and see what she had bought. But the day had been longer than she knew, and the walk had taken more out of her than she had reckoned, and the cold of the stone through her boots was already blurring at the edges. Her head tipped once. She jerked it upright. It tipped again. She slept, sitting up on a settle, in a dead lord's kitchen, with the great key in her hands and the door of Fellwick Lodge open at her back to the night. Somewhere above her, in the shuttered dark of the upper floor, a board creaked once, as though a house that had been holding its breath for 20 years had finally let it go. Susan woke to gray light and the sound of a jackdaw calling from a chimney. Her neck ached. Her hands had opened in sleep, and the iron key lay across her knee. She sat still for a moment and did not remember. And then she remembered. The kitchen was clearer by day than she had feared. A high window above the scullery door, unshuttered from the inside, let a pale square of light onto the flagstones. The table was oak, scored and scrubbed by many years of hands. Copper pans hung on nails along the far wall, dulled but not stolen. A row of blue and white plates stood in a rack, not the house of a family driven out. the house of a family that had walked away between one meal and the next. Susan rose, stiff, and set the key on the table. She went first to the front door and closed it, and the bolt slid home more easily than it had turned the night before, as if the lock preferred to be shut. Then she walked the ground floor slowly, room by room, in the dim light that came through the gaps between boarded planks. There was a hall with a black slate floor and a staircase turning up into darkness. There was a parlor with dust sheets over the furniture, humped like sleeping animals. There was a smaller room, wood-paneled, with a desk under a sheet and a wall of books swollen with damp. There was a gun room, empty of guns, its racks bare, though the pegs were still numbered in ink. There was a pantry with jars gone black inside and a stone slab where meat had once hung. Everywhere the same held breath. Everywhere the same absence, as though the people had stepped out for a walk 20 years ago and never come back. Susan returned to the paneled room. Something in it had caught at her as she passed. She stood in the doorway and let her eyes travel it again. The desk, the books, the cold hearth, the two narrow windows boarded from without, the paneling, dark oak, running floor to ceiling. Then she saw it. Above the fireplace, where in any gentleman's room there ought to have hung a portrait or a stag's head or a framed map, the paneling was bare and slightly paler than the wood around it, a rectangle roughly 2 feet by 3, the outline of something long taken down. That was ordinary enough. Houses shed their pictures. But at the center of that paler rectangle, cut cleanly into the panel with a knife, was a name, not carved in the flourish of a mason, cut in small, plain block letters no deeper than a fingernail, as though someone had done it quickly and meant it to be found only by a person who came close. Susan crossed the room and put her fingers to it. The letters read, Hannah. She stood a long time with her hand on the wood. Hannah was not the name of the lord who had owned the lodge. She did not yet know his name, but she knew that. It was not the name on the folded paper in her bodice. It was not a name any voice in the sale room had said. It was a woman's name, cut where a portrait had hung, in a room that had held a man's desk and a man's guns. She did not pry at it. She did not fetch a knife or a lamp. She only stood and looked, and after a long moment took her hand away and went out of the room and closed the door softly behind her, as one closes the door of a room in which a child has just fallen asleep. That day Susan began to work. She had no money for tools and no help, and so she used what the house had left her. In the scullery she found a stiff broom, a scrubbing brush worn to a stub, a tin pail, and a wooden bucket bound with 2 iron hoops. In the yard she found a well with its cover still sound and a chain that took her weight when she leaned on it. The water came up dark at first, and then clear, tasting of stone. She began with the kitchen. She swept the flagstones twice, once dry and once damp, and the dust that came out of the corners was the dust of years, gray and soft as moth-wing. She took down each copper pan and washed it in the pail and hung it back on its nail. She scrubbed the oak table with sand from the yard until the grain came up pale and honest under her hand. By the second afternoon, when she stood back and looked at it, the kitchen was a room in which a person could sit down. On the third day a cat came. Susan was on her knees in the scullery, scouring the stone slab, when she felt herself watched and looked up. A large gray cat sat in the open doorway to the yard. Its coat was matted along one flank, and one ear was notched, but it was not thin. It looked at her with steady yellow eyes and did not move when she rose. She set down a saucer of well water. The cat drank, unhurried, and then walked past her into the kitchen and lay down on the hearthstone as though it had been away only a morning. Susan named it nothing. She only said, "You are welcome," and the cat closed its eyes. After that the cat was with her at every hour. It sat on the settle when she scrubbed. It walked ahead of her down the hall when she carried her pail from room to room. When she stopped to eat the hard bread and cheese she had bought in the village with a coin borrowed against a promise of work, the cat sat at her foot and did not beg, but watched. The house began to give up its secrets to her hands before her mind had caught them. In the parlor, lifting a dust sheet, Susan found a small writing table with a drawer, and in the drawer a lady's glove, still paired with its mate, the leather stiff but whole, sized for a small hand. In the gun room, sweeping behind the empty racks, she found a child's wooden horse on wheels, its paint flaked, but its mane still black horsehair. In the hall, prizing a warped board back into place with the flat of the poker, she found beneath it a hairpin of tortoiseshell, and beside that a single dried sprig of lavender tied with a scrap of blue ribbon. She set each of these on the kitchen table in the order she found them. She did not yet know what she was doing. Her hands were arranging a family the village had told her did not exist. On the fourth evening, scrubbing the paneling of the small parlor, Susan's cloth caught on a raised place low on the wall behind the settle, near the floor. She bent with her candle and saw, cut into the panel in the same small block letters as the name above the fireplace, 2 more words, "and the child." She sat back on her heels. The cat came and pressed its head against her knee. The candle flame stood straight in the still air of the room. Susan did not weep and did not speak. She only knew, in the way her hands had already known, that she had bought more than a house. She slept that night in the kitchen with the candle guttered out and the cat curled against her hip, and she dreamed of nothing she could later name. In the morning she went back to the small parlor with a lamp she had trimmed from a tin of oil found under the scullery sink. She moved the settle away from the wall. She knelt again and read the words again by daylight, and this time she noticed what her candle had not shown her the night before, that the panel bearing the words was not fixed to the wall behind it. A hair's breadth of shadow ran around 3 of its edges. Susan set the lamp on the floor and worked the point of a table knife into the seam. The panel gave. It was not nailed. It had been fitted to lift out, and someone had lifted it before her and set it back with care. Behind the panel was a shallow recess in the stone, no deeper than her forearm, and inside the recess lay a japanned tin box the length of a Bible, black, its lid dulled with dust. Susan drew it out with both hands and set it on the floorboards. The cat sat on the edge of the settle and watched. Susan wiped the lid with her apron. There was no lock, only a small catch stiff with age. She worked it loose. She lifted the lid. Inside, in the top of the box, lay a folded square of white linen. Susan lifted it aside. Beneath the linen lay letters, tied with a faded ribbon that had once been blue. Beneath the letters lay a small book bound in dark green cloth. Beneath the book lay a folded document sealed with red wax, the seal unbroken. Beneath that lay a smaller cloth bundle heavy in her hand, which when unwrapped showed a woman's gold ring, thin and worn, and beside it a smaller ring of the same gold sized for a child's finger. Susan sat on the floor with the box between her knees. She untied the ribbon. The topmost letter was addressed in a firm hand to Hannah at Felwick Lodge. She did not read it yet. She opened the green book. It was a diary in a woman's hand, dated in the first pages some 24 years past. She turned to the last page that had been written. The final entry was short. It said only, "He rides to town tomorrow to sign what he has promised. If God is kind, we shall be named at last." Below it, the page was blank. Susan closed the diary and took up the sealed document. The wax bore the print of a signet, a stag's head and 3 small stars. She did not break the seal. She had seen enough deeds in her uncle's parlor to know the shape of one under her hand. She read the endorsement written along the fold in the same firm hand as the letters. It said, "Last will and testament, to be opened only by Hannah Marsden or by the child of my body, Thomas." Susan sat very still. Marsden was not a name she had heard in the village, and yet she had heard it once on the lips of the auctioneer as he set his hammer down, when he had said of the lord who had owned the lodge, only, "The late Marsden, the child of my body, Thomas." Susan laid her hand flat on the folded paper and did not lift it for a long time. The lamp burned. The cat breathed. The house held its silence around her like a cupped hand around a candle. She did not break the seal that day. She wrapped the diary again in the linen, tied the letters back with their ribbon, laid the rings in their cloth, closed the tin, and set it on the kitchen table beside the glove and the wooden horse and the hairpin and the lavender. She sat on the settle a long while and did not eat. That evening, for the first time since she had come to Felwick, Susan wept once quietly, with her face against the cat's gray flank, for a woman and a child she had never met and now would not leave. The storm came on the third night after. It began with a thickening of the air at dusk and a green light behind the beeches, and by full dark the wind had come up out of the north and taken the loose slate at the sagging end of the roof and thrown it into the yard. Rain drove sideways against the boarded windows. In the small parlor, water began to run down the inside of the west wall. Susan set the tin box high on the mantel and moved the kitchen pans under the worst of the leaks. She barred the front door and drew the settle across the draught. The cat went under the table and did not come out. Near midnight, over the sound of the wind, Susan heard a knocking at the door. She thought at first it was a shutter. Then she heard it again, weak and steady, 3 raps and a pause and 3 raps. She took up the poker and unbarred the door. A woman stood on the step, soaked through, holding a child of perhaps 4, wrapped in a wet shawl. Behind her stood a boy of 9 or 10 with his face white and his hands blue. The woman said, "The bridge is out. We saw your light." Susan looked past them into the black, roaring lane. She said, "Come in." She barred the door behind them. She took the child from the woman first. She stripped the wet shawl and wrapped the child in her own dry blanket from the settle. She put the boy by the hearth and pulled off his sodden boots. She built the fire higher with the last of the beech she had gathered and set water in the copper. She gave the woman her shawl, dry from the peg. The woman was younger than Susan had thought at the door, perhaps 30, with a face gone thin from the walking. She said her husband had gone ahead to Marley for work and left them to follow with the carrier, and the carrier had put them down at the crossroads because his horse would not face the wind, and she had walked the last mile with the children because there was nowhere else to walk to. Susan asked no more. She made tea from a screw of leaves she had bought that week and had not yet opened. She set the child on the settle with the cat, and the cat, which had not gone to anyone but Susan in 7 days, climbed onto the child's lap and stayed. The boy fell asleep against the warm stones of the hearth. The woman sat at the table and cried without sound, and Susan let her and put bread in her hand when the crying had stopped. Somewhere above them a beam groaned as the wind took the roof again, and Susan looked up at the ceiling and thought of the tin box on the mantel and of the 2 names cut into the panel, and knew, plainly as one knows a thing at last, that she would not leave this house, and would not sell its key for a shilling, and would not go down the hill in the morning. She would stay. She would find Thomas Marsden if he lived, and if he did not, she would keep the house for his memory and for Hannah's. She sat down beside the sleeping boy and put another log on the fire, and outside the storm went on, and inside, for the first time in 20 years, the lodge held a family through the night. By dawn the wind had fallen, and the rain had thinned to a soft gray drizzle. The woman slept at the table with her head on her arms. The boy slept curled against the hearth. The child on the settle slept with the cat still on her lap. Susan banked the fire, put on her damp shawl, and walked down to the village while the light was still blue. The bridge below the beeches had indeed given way, half its planks torn off into the swollen brook. Susan took the upper path. In the square, a small crowd had gathered because word had gone round in the night that a carrier's family had been lost in the storm. The woman's husband stood there with wet hair and a face like ash, asking after his wife and children. Susan crossed the cobbles and told him, "They are at the lodge, all warm." The square went quiet. The husband gripped her hand without speaking. A shopkeeper looked at Susan differently. The unnamed old woman under the yew was there again on her bench, and she nodded once when Susan passed. That afternoon, a village carter, without being asked, drove a load of dry beech logs up the hill and left them stacked by the yard wall. A woman brought a basket with eggs, a loaf, and a stone jar of milk, set it on the step, and went away before Susan could thank her. By evening, 2 men had come to look at the fallen slate on the roof, and said they would come back on the morrow with a ladder and would take no coin for it. Susan did not send for the solicitor. She wrote a plain letter with a nib and ink she found in the desk, and gave it to the carter for the post. She addressed it to the office of a Mr. Hallam in Marley, whose name she had read on an old envelope inside the japanned box. Mr. Hallam came within 3 days. He was a thin, calm man of 60 in a black coat, with steady gray eyes and a leather case under his arm. Susan showed him the panel, the recess, the tin box, the diary, the letters, the rings, and the sealed document with the stag's head and 3 small stars. Mr. Hallam sat at the kitchen table for a long time without speaking. Then he said quietly, "I drew this will. It was thought lost." He said the seal was unbroken. He said the endorsement bound him. He said the child Thomas Marsden had been sent as an infant to a farming family in the north, and he believed the man lived still, and he would write that very night. He looked at Susan across the table and said, "You have kept faith with a house that broke no one's promise but its owner's silence." Susan did not answer. The red-faced squire came up the hill on the 4th day with his hat in his hand. He stood in the yard and did not come to the door. He said he had been wrong at the sale room. He said he would not have bid $3 for that house himself, and he was ashamed to have laughed at one who did. Susan told him, "There is tea inside if you would come in." He came in. He drank his cup at the kitchen table beside the wooden horse and the glove and the hairpin and the sprig of lavender, and he did not speak again until he set the cup down and thanked her. Word of Felwick spread. A farmer from 10 miles off wrote to say he had known Hannah as a girl. A curate came to see the panel. The village that had said, "She'll be back before breakfast," now touched their caps at the pump when Susan passed. Thomas Marsden came in the last week before Christmas, in a plain coat, driving his own trap. He was a man of 24, with his mother's mouth and his father's eyes. Mr. Hallam broke the red seal in his presence at the kitchen table, and read the will aloud in a level voice. It named Hannah Marsden lawful wife by a private marriage witnessed and signed, and named Thomas heir of the lodge, the estate lands, the plate and papers, and all that lay unclaimed these 20 years. Thomas listened to the end. Then he crossed to Susan, took her reddened hands in his own, and said, "You kept the house. It is yours as long as you wish it." He asked her to stay on as its keeper. Susan bowed her head and said she would. On a clear evening in the first days of the new year, Susan stood on the front step of Felwick Lodge with the great iron key in her hand. The sun was low behind the beeches and laid a long copper light along the sagging roof, now mended, and along the yard wall where the beech logs were stacked in neat rows. The boarded windows were open, and clean glass caught the light. The cat sat on the step at her feet. Somewhere in the house a child was laughing, for the woman and her family had stayed on until the husband found a cottage in the village, and they came often to sit by the kitchen fire. Thomas Marsden's trap could be heard turning up the lane in the distance. Susan looked at the key in her hand and at the copper light on the stone, and said quietly, to no one in particular, "It was never a grave. It was only waiting to be kept." She stepped back inside and drew the door to, but did not lock it. Thank you for staying to the end of Susan's long road home. If the quiet courage of a girl who would not leave what others had left moved you tonight, do leave a like, share a word in the comments where you are watching from, and subscribe so you may sit by the next hearth with us. Another story is already waiting down the lane.